Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the second episode of So Tell Me with Phil Bhojwanay, the show where questions about society and its utter stupidity are raised based on my mood for the day. My very special guest today, or rather this evening, because he's doing the show with us today live from New York, is none other than the amazing Kreskin. He's made appearances on some of the biggest talk shows in history. He's appeared on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson a staggering 61 times, followed by appearances on my personal favorite host of all time, David Letterman, on The Late Show with David Letterman, and most recently, a couple of years ago, correct me if I'm wrong, The Late Show starring Jimmy Fallon, who thrice, I think you did that. Mr. Kreskin, welcome to the show. I'm sorry I have to read all this out from a paper, but I'm a one-man army over here, as you can see. Anyway, thank you for joining us all the way from New York. It is much appreciated, and it is an absolute pleasure to have you on the show.
You know, I gotta say a few more things, because since you're doing a talk show and these people are legends in my life, the actual amount of times I did the Carson show was 88 times.
Wow.
It was sad when Regis Philbin stepped off his show about a year and a half ago, because I did 105 shows with Regis, which they tell me is a record number of guests. But I'll tell you, I get a kick out of you. And folks, Phil may not want me to mention this, but he's a character looming in the sidelines there by the name of Alex. And I'm being very, very cautious, not so much because you folks are listening, but because if Alex is there, and because Alex is there and is a young man, I'm going to promise him that I will not read Phil's thoughts on live television. Oh, my God. Then we would be in trouble. That's all I can say.
I got to tell you,
Phil, I got to tell you a story about Carson.
Yes, sir.
I never, and I've been doing this all my life. The airline industry estimated at about last year that I have flown in my career a little over 3 million miles, a little over 3 million. And so I'm on the road much of the time, but I never intended to use the term amazing. But I was coming off planes when I started becoming more nationally known in the 80s and 90s, and people said to me, "Hi, amazing." When they'd be walking off, I say, "Gee, that's nice. They must have seen me, on Carson or Regis or what have you." Mm-hmm. And then it turns out Carson had a routine. And those of you who were around then and will know, and when I say around then, I don't mean it was in the 1880s. It was the 1980s, 90s, 2000, what have you. With Ed McMahon, he'd say, Kreskin was on 2 weeks ago. He was only 90% amazing. And Ed McMahon say, no, he was 95% amazing. And Phil, talk about how something can linger and hang on. That's how it came about. But I got to tell you also how all this business with Carson started. Mm-hmm. There was a man before you were born, the greatest wit I ever knew in my life, a brilliant comedian. His name was Steve Allen.
Yes, sir.
And he hosted The Tonight Show way before Johnny, and his mother was a clown in vaudeville. And he hosted The Tonight Show. And when he left the show, Phil, he moved to L.A., and he had a late night talk show in which college students were watching and everything else. And I was already traveling, even though I was in college. And they didn't hear about me. They knew about me in New York and New Jersey. So someone told him about me, and he says, we'll fly him into L.A. Now, watch this, folks, at home. Picture this scenario. I fly out to L.A. I remember seeing Steve Allen at The Tonight Show, but I didn't know him. And I said to the crew, I don't meet the people who I'm going to work with on camera before the show, because I want it to be. They say, we understand, Kreskin. We understand. Now, Steve Allen is on camera. He says, we have a young man who has a unique gift. We're all interested in ESP and the power of the mind. Would you welcome Kreskin? And Phil, I walk out. It's now in the late 60s. The lights are hot in those days, and I'm watching the camera like a fool. I'm keeping my eyes on the camera as I'm walking towards Steve Allen, who's 6'4" and standing on a dais, the way Letterman, the way Carson, the way everybody does. But I'm not, and as I'm getting closer to him, the lights are blinding me. I go over to shake hands with Steve Allen, trip over the dais, and on national TV fall flat on my face.
Oh, my.
And my family considers that the highlight of my career, because there I'm on the floor. And Steve Allen did not take any cheap shots. He said, "You all right, Kreskin? Well, come on, we'll go on with the show." And I went on. A man left NBC as he did always early that night because he recorded his show early in the evening. It was Johnny Carson. Johnny was at home. He had turned on Steve Allen. He saw a mentalist was going to be on. And he watched the show and saw me walk towards Allen and fall flat on my face. And 8 weeks later, Johnny Carson created Karnak, the Swami with the turban that kept falling over the desk. That was me. So I warn you, don't try to hide these, Phil. It can't be done today.
I completely agree with you. I mean, these are some amazing stories. And you know what I want to do is actually reintroduce the golden age of comedy because I love that so much. To me, that is what comedy is, was, and always will be. Today, everything's gotten too out of hand. It's too PC. And, I'm going to be very, very honest with you. I'm not a big fan of Jimmy Fallon, to be honest. It's very game show humor. I don't like it. There's nothing. When the moment Letterman left, that was the end of late night for me, to be honest with you.
Fallon has been very good to me, and he's a very genuinely a nice person. He, by the way, revered Carson. But I got to tell you something. I have to tell you something that the people, Letterman and those that followed the Tonight Show and what have you, they learned. Today, it's not so much the case. In the early days of television, there was no turning back. A person made a mistake. He made a stupid, asinine remark. You played with it. You ran with it. Because these people, like Steve Allen and Carson, came out of live performances and so forth, and they weren't used to doing things over again. Today, Phil, if you believe that the reality shows are for real, I'm going to send you the Brooklyn Bridge because I will not go into details. I have friends who work in camera crews and what have you. And there's one famous story last year. I don't want to go into different families that you see living these crazy lives. They had an argument in 2 years ago. They had an argument in a clothing store. And they were arguing, and it got all over the industry. People found it fascinating. Truth of the matter is, they rehearsed that argument 9 times before they got it correct. So anybody who thinks that these reality shows are for real, you gotta really take a second check. That's the flavor that's disappeared from a lot of television. There just is no turning back. And by the way, Carson's philosophy and others were, you make a mistake, you run with it, because some of the best incidents happened when things were going wrong and you you had fun with it or you ran with it.
That's right.
One time, Jack Parr, who was in the Tonight Show before Carson, he did a commercial for one of the aspirin companies. It was Alka-Seltzer. And it's one of the opening night commercials. I will never forget this. He mixes it with water and mixes it further and puts another batch in. And what do you suddenly have? You have things smoking. You have the damn commercial bubbling all over the place. Oh, by the way, the next day, he lost the commercial. But I got to tell you, it was on the conversation over every water cooler and every business in the United States because they said, did you see what happened, damn it, last night? That was wild. That was what television was all about, liveness.
Absolutely, you're absolutely correct. And just to touch on the reality show stuff, I'm not a big fan of it. I'm not a fan of it at all. I actually think that reality TV is for fake people. That's what I always say.
Well, you mentioned Regis.
Yes, sir.
And you heard, years ago, opposite Johnny Carson was a show called The Joey Bishop Show. That's right. And that's where Regis got known because he was Joey Bishop's announcer. And one night, I'm on the show. And I got to tell you something. There was no turning back then, even though the show was taped. You didn't turn it around. And Regis had walked off the show at the beginning of the show. And Joey's standing there, and we had to go on and perform. And how do you go on and perform when the crew's thinking, what in God's name happened? That's Regis right. Is gone, and how can Joey be funny and so forth? Well, some years later, I'm sitting having lunch with Regis in New York. I said, Regis, I know you've never discussed this in all these days you've been on. You're on every day now, 90 minutes or so. What happened that night? And Regis looks at me. He says, do you really want me to tell you what took place? I said, yeah, Regis. He says, Joey and I walked to work every night. Regis did it in New York from his apartment. We walked to work. And one night, Joey's kind of down and says, Johnny's opposite us. You know he has all the ratings, Regis, and it's just one of those things. And Regis says, "But Joey, you are a genuine talent. You're a good guy. You know the business, and we work well. I love working with you as a team." And they're getting closer and closer to the ABC doors. And as they're about to open the door, Joey turns to Regis and says, "You know what? What harm is it going to do? Why don't you walk off the damn show tonight?" And it all came from a casual remark that no writer thought of. And Regis stayed off for days and days and days. And we're all in it. And I'm on the show that night thinking, oh my God, what a disaster.
I remember
Interesting
that.
how things happen on the spur of a moment, and it worked.
Spontaneity. That's the best part of doing comedy. It's just being spontaneous, being in the moment, and I love it. And that's what
Well,
that's what the new
that's
ones
what's so
don't have.
great about Don Rickles,
That's right.
because it doesn't matter. Frank Sinatra was a very disciplined man, and like Johnny Carson. And by the way, people don't know this. Johnny Carson did not want surprises on his show. He says, "You let me know what's going to happen. I can handle it." But he gave free rein to Rickles in the same way that Sinatra did. They respected him enough that they were
Yes.
happy to be mocked and ridiculed by him, because
You can't censor
behind
him.
all that there was a genuine kindness.
That's right. Rickles is a very good man. He's got a heart of gold, and people who know him, I don't know him, but you know what? I tell you this straight up. If Rickles is even listening to this, and I hope that he does, please take me out to dinner, as you do with Jimmy Kimmel and David Letterman and whoever you have. I will fly to LA just to do this, and you are the best, and there isn't anybody better. That's my word for Rickles. Thank you so much for being an influence on me. That's what he's done. He's literally influenced me to do comedy.
And I got to tell you, it's a significant situation in the United States. I don't know if this is true in Australia, but in the United States, what's going on today, which is sad. Seinfeld, who's a very brilliant man, he put together a wonderful series based on simple things in life that they just made a whole scenario about. He announced just a few weeks ago, and some of you may have heard it in Australia, that he will not perform at a university again. And that's not like him. And the simple reason is, when you now have, whoever believed this would be the case, that you're going to be censored for what you joke about and kid about, and you appear on the stage in the university where free thought is supposed to be the rule, and that's what started to happen in the States.
It's killing comedy, isn't it? I read about this a few months ago, and I could relate to it, because I actually was a roast comedian. I am a roast comedian, rather was. I just stopped doing it because the very last gig I had was, get this, to 300 oncologists in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. And they specified for a roast comedian. And what is a roast? A roast is you get made fun of.
That's right. And I've done roasts for some of the most famous at the Friars. I've been on the stage where they mocked them off the wall.
Exactly. And so it wasn't well received. And I said, look, you know what? I am the problem. You are the problem. Because
wasn't well received.
No, because they said he was too aggressive. What do you think a roast is, my friend?
Too aggressive. That's what... Hey, you know something? I don't have to be a thought reader or mentalist to say this, and my background's in psychology. Mm-hmm. The day we can no longer laugh at ourselves, we are in damn trouble. Because when I was a little boy, by the way, I was not a little boy in the 1880s. I was a little boy during the Second World War. You had people in the movies, Jack Benny, doing movies where people were dressed as Hitler and Nazis, these yes. evil, terrible people, and we were laughing at them because that was our way of handling the stress. Nobody was upset. We mocked them and we laughed at them.
I remember that. I remember Jack Benny. I remember all the stories
Jack Benny was one of the greatest talents you could ever imagine, and he was very, very loyal to the people he had on. He had Liberace on, mocked him off the face of the earth, and was so pleased that Liberace took it good-naturedly that Jack Benny gave him an extraordinarily expensive automobile as a gift.
Wow.
That's the kind of person Jack Benny was.
Can I just put in there, not to forget, because I know that this man was a big deal. Jack Benny, that is, and even this other man I'm about to mention was Milton Berle.
Oh, Mel! I got to tell you a story about Milton Berle.
Please.
Milton Berle was a fan of mine,
yes.
And of course he, when I was a kid, started nighttime television furor because he became #1 on Tuesday nights in the United States from 8 to 9 o'clock. So I'm on. This is after he had been somewhat retired, and they're doing a show, a salute to him. Mm-hmm. And they brought me on, and Milton Berle says, "You know, I've I've admired Kreskin all through and all. Even I don't want to go into what he had to say, but I was very pleased about this. And we're talking, and he said, and I said, Milton, you really dominated the show even off camera. He says, yes, Kreskin. I directed the cameraman. I directed the gal with the costumes. I directed the lighting and the walking on the stage because I came out of live vaudeville, and a lot of the people in television were not that way. In fact, and I said, I understand. I never knew much about it, but in the beginning, early days, you didn't get that much pay. He says, I got a surprise for you. It's a true story. He said, I have a surprise for you. Mm-hmm. He said, I never talked about this. I'm going to tell you and here's the way he spoke, and I stopped and I said,
he used to do a lot of that as well.
Was the amount, and I said 14 something, I forget, it was $1,000 a week. And he stopped and said, Kreskin, I've never made it public. This guy, Kreskin, is legitimate. I got from his thinking the exact amount he couldn't remember consciously. But he was a character. And by the way, those shows were live. You could not, when things fell into the audience or people toppled over, that was the way it went. But, in vaudeville, this happened every day after day, and performers had to run with it, whether it was with Milton Berle or Laurel and Hardy, you name it.
Absolutely correct. This was the Texaco Theater, wasn't it?
That's right.
Yes.
You even got the commercial. And oh my God!
Yes.
I want to tell folks, this guy is a walking lexicographer and an encyclopedia. As I said it before, and I'm being more cautious now. I dare not read Phil's thoughts on the air because we don't want to get in trouble. Go on, Phil.
Thank you so much. I mean, this is perfect for me. I mean, I want to reintroduce the golden age to a whole new bunch. This new generation of millennial idiots, as I call them. This is what I say. I perhaps come under that being 31 years old, but I am not a true blue millennial. So there's a big difference over there.
Well, let me.
Yes,
Phil. I'm going to tell you a story that is not living the past, but is an education.
Yes, sir.
But people don't know. When I was a little kid and we didn't have television, we had radio. People that went on the radio were dressed in tuxedos. Mm-hmm. The women were dressed in evening gowns. They never were seen.
Correct.
And I never heard of this. I thought, this is crazy. And they were saying, ladies and gentlemen. And then a man who became the most powerful figure in the history of American television got hit by a car in Washington and was in a hospital bed for 3 months. And he heard these people talking to each other saying, you listeners out there, ladies and gentlemen, he thought to himself, my God, if I'm listening to the radio, I'm home by myself. If I'm with other people, I'm conversing with them. But if I'm home, I'm cleaning the floor, doing it. If I ever get on the radio, I'm going to forget about the ladies and gentlemen. This man, a few years later, got on the air and slowly became the most powerful figure in broadcasting. His name was Arthur Godfrey. And when he looked into the camera, he spoke to people as if he was talking only to one person. Mm-hmm. And that's where live television and radio became its true gift. The person at home felt it was directed not at a large audience, but at one person. That's the true art of a communicator.
You're absolutely correct. And I think that, excuse me, Johnny Carson, David Letterman had that.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and...
by the way, can I tell you something? I want to tell you an inside story.
Of course, yes.
David Letterman revered Johnny Carson.
Yes, sir, he did.
And when Johnny went off the air, mm-hmm. and Letterman sat there on camera, Johnny Carson had no longer left television because for over 1 year, that telephone in front of Letterman was a direct phone to Johnny Carson's home. And during breaks, Carson would call Letterman and give him one or two one-liner tips and Letterman would put it down. That's how close they stayed, even after he, quote, retired.
Wow. And knowing Letterman being such a private man, this was not a story I would have known. I do remember, however...
No, he never made that public. But it was, I stood off camera many times and he said, Kreskin, I said, I know, tell Johnny, I said, my regards. He picks up the phone and said, what'd you think of that? This is the way they worked. Carson loved the industry, but he also saw some dramatic changes taking place in it. And, when you think of the characters he created, it was exciting because he would. But one thing he never talked about was when I was on with him during a commercial break. Listen to this if you were in the studio audience.
Mm-hmm.
He and I would sometime, Phil, you're not going to believe this, get out of our chairs, go under the desk and sit there. And the viewers in the audience thinking, what the hell is going on? Because we had no microphone, it was a commercial. And then just before I went back on the air, Carson went back and sat there. And Fred de Cordova, who was his producer, he had two great legends in his life. He produced for Jack Benny, and he produced after that for Carson. Years later, when Carson left, whenever I was in L.A. doing television, de Cordova would come and sit in my dressing room. And one day he said to me, Kreskin, what the hell were the two of you doing under the desk there? He says, I was afraid to ask Johnny because if Johnny didn't want things talked about. He said, what were you doing? I said, Fred, you know, Carson liked to handle cards. I said, yeah, he did, but he was not an amateur. He said, even though I was known as a mentalist, he knew that I had a skill with cards. And under the desk, and someday I'll do this on camera, he would put a deck of cards in front of me and say, Kreskin, 14. Instantly, Phil, I would hand him a cut, and it was exactly 14 cards. I could feel every card. It would drive him. He says, my God, no wonder you can't gamble at any casino. That's what was going on under the desk. And his crew never knew. They must have thought, this sounds very shady, sitting under the desk with Carson.
It does. I mean, today we'd come with something else. Obviously, we'd something dirty would go through the mind, but we're not going to get into that. But
where did these 45 minutes is this 2 hours or you listeners listening in? I like to banter with this man because this man likes things to come off of left field or off the other direction. But that's the way often I think. I will also tell you one more thing. Mm-hmm. That I had a rule in almost all the shows I ever did. The one thing I would do with the host on camera, they never told him ahead of time because they enjoyed seeing the reaction of performers. And Carson and Letterman. And by the way, one day I walk on with Dave. I go on the David Letterman show and I have a box in my hand. No one told him. And I put the box on a chair and David looks, he's not upset because he knows he sees the box there. And I said, well, David, this has to do with something that's going to take place in your mind. He picks up the phone, David, as like he's talking to producers and saying, what the hell is going on? And at that moment, what did I do? I got on my chair and lay on the floor. And Letterman sees about the phone, he's saying, we got to go to a break. And I went to a break and Letterman said, that was a great bit, Craig. But that's the way we function.
That's the proper way. Those were all bits. I remember one time, I want to talk about Rickles a little bit, back to Rickles again. He went on Jimmy Fallon a couple of months ago, and
yes, he did.
He annihilated Jimmy Fallon right off the bat, and he made fun of him because Jimmy Fallon's been falling on his finger for some reason. I don't know what's going on. He's fallen 3 or 4 times.
4 times he's done this.
Yes. What is he falling on? I don't know. I'm not going to say, but I think it was he had his finger bandaged.
He hit one hand very badly, by the way.
That's right. So Rickles tells him, that's a great bit that you have over there. And Fallon goes, this is not a bit. He says, yeah, next time come up with your neck wrapped. And I just cracked up laughing, and I couldn't contain myself. And this is the genius of Rickles. I believe he's 89 now, going on 90. Until today, he sells out shows. He is the only comedian that is, from the golden age, the only one that's still alive, I think.
So the only one I don't know of any that are still alive from that era. Yeah. Of course, Berle passed away just a few years ago, but he really was. And the great thing about people like that is that they built a following that became very, very loyal, and the performers themselves respected them with great awe. I mean, look at all the satires done by Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin's, his roasts, the half-hour roast. They were a wonderful flavor.
They were the best. I'm sorry to interject, but I just have to say this out loud because I need to get this out of my system. Those were the roasts that you will never ever get today. And I want them
No, you
back.
get them today.
I want
No,
them
they're
back.
not the same today. They are not the same. They unfortunately they become contrived ahead of time. But when those roasts took place, let me tell you how. Now, folks, you might as well know about this. You're thinking, well, maybe they were scripted and everything
They
else.
weren't.
Now I'll tell you the true story about Dean Martin.
Mhm.
One of Dean Martin's greatest bits, and it was not only when he was with the four of them in Vegas, and Sammy Davis and Joey Bishop and Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin were on the stage bantering between each other. They had a ball as they kidded each other and what have you. And of course, when Dean Martin did his show, he'd come on with a glass of wine or liquor and put it on the piano, and sometimes in the piano and so forth. Dean Martin didn't touch a damn sip of liquor, maybe rarely on his own. He found that was a gimmick that worked, and he got away with it because everybody thought he's got to come on slightly tipsy. The tipsy was in the way his mind handled it.
That was the genius of Dean Martin, wasn't it? Now that is something I have to admit I did not know that. That this is news to me, and the fact that you say this, that is amazing to know. I sincerely thought he was always buzzed on the roast. He was not.
He didn't have to be. His life took a tragic turn when he lost his son in the service, and then Dean Martin couldn't go. He didn't have the spirit to go on. Frank Sinatra felt such compassion. He brought him out of retirement. But it just wasn't the same situation. He was a very talented man. All these people, by the way, all these singers, Sinatra, Dean Martin, all those singers, their model was someone that was forgotten today, a man by the name of Bing Crosby. That was their model, period. Sinatra admitted it. They all did. He was an innovator in singing. Because he found out something.
Uh-huh.
Something was brought into show business since the days of Al Jolson and stage performances, a close microphone. And Crosby turned that microphone into a love affair, the way he spoke and sang into it. Listen to the singers of his time. They all were trying to imitate him. So it's funny how sometimes a person can adapt to a new device, just as Arthur Godfrey looked into the camera and said, I know you're at home and it's raining probably outside, and you wish you could. And people at home said, "Oh my God, he's talking the way I think," because people felt that these performers could somehow identify with them.
Wow, that was well. You got me twice now with that. Singer-wise, I know.
By the way, I'm going to come back. I have a book coming out, which we'll talk about the next time, called In Real Time. And it took me 2 years. I don't want to talk about it in real time, but in a few weeks, it's going to be available in Australia as well as around the world. It's my 20th book, and maybe we can talk about it.
Absolutely.
That's a post-hypnotic, folks.
Let me just put this out there.
At Bill Strong, he's going to have a tremendous urge. He's not going to be able to resist. He's going to have to talk to me about the book, Nick. That's a powerful suggestion.
Kreskin, I'm going to call you Mr. Kreskin. You are more than welcome on my show anytime you want.
Thank you. Bill.
Anytime.
Thank you.
Anytime you want. I just want. Can I ask you, while we're still on the Dean Martin thing, before I segue to something else? A lot of people, in terms of black comedians, cite Richard Pryor as their main guy. Why do people forget Red Fox? I thought he was a very funny man. Do you remember Red Fox?
He was a very funny man, but I think, I think part of, and I don't have a specific answer, but you got to understand that, first of all, the most known comedian of the last century, we can juggle people around. We can talk about people around. Well, let's give a man his dues. No man ever left his stamp on the show business, the history of show business in the last century, and no comedian more so than Bob Hope.
Yes.
Because you have to realize during an entire war, this man performed before servicemen all over the world. The way it happened was accidentally. In the late 30s, he was doing a radio show, and they said, let's do a couple of shows at an army base. And the army base, they reacted so strongly that he said, my audience from now on will be servicemen. And he never performed for a nightclub audience, never appeared before nightclub audiences. His audiences were either fundraisers or servicemen around the world. But because of people like that, and Berle, who kept appearing on other shows, and Jack Benny, who made a storyline, they fitted into the framework of our everyday thought because they became characters. And some other comedians who were just as good, they just didn't seem to have that opportunity, if you understand. You know, you got to understand.
Yes, and I agree with you.
When Desi Arnaz came to Lucy and said, you know, we're going to do a talk show. She was not a comedian, but she was an extraordinary actress, and he saw in her the ability to turn her acting into a comedy fine, and it really worked with her.
I remember I Love Lucy was a great show, and I actually remember her on the roast as well, and Rickles roasting her, and I think he hit the mic.
That was a good one. He roasted her.
He broke the mic with his hands. I remember him with George C. Scott as well. I mean, look, the whole dais was amazing. Alan King, Jerry Lewis, Dean Martin, Frank Sinatra, you name it, they were all there. Charlie Callis was there, and I know that Charlie Callis had an issue with Johnny Carson one time when he was banned from the show. I remember that.
These things happen. You know. People have positions, and well, I'll leave you with one more story. That's a classic story, behind the scenes story, that shows the thinking of Johnny Carson and the thinking of probably one of the greatest giants in movie history. A story that you folks at home don't know about. One night, this gentleman was on Carson's show, and Johnny Carson revered him. He would take him to dinner. After the show, they would go out to eat. They would go to a certain club in Los Angeles. And one night, during a commercial break, he said, when we come back on, I'm going to be on again Monday. You're not going to be here. And Johnny says, well, you know, I take off Mondays. You're going to be hosting that show. He says, yes. Now, this is during the break. No one heard this at home. He says, Monday, I'm going to do a Kreskin. And Fred de Cordova, who came to my dressing room months later and told me the story, said, you would have had to have been there, Kreskin. I said, what do you mean? He said, Johnny slowly turned his head to him and said, what did you say? He says, I'm going to do a Kreskin. Nothing more said. Monday was Johnny's day off, except Johnny came to work and he told his crew, if you let this out, I will fire you. He hid on the set. Johnny Carson never hid on the set of his own show.
Yeah, Jay Leno does that.
Off backstage by a door. The guy came on. He said, well, I met this seer, this gypsy, and she taught me this ability. I'm going to ask you to call some numbers out from the audience. I'll write them on this blackboard and call one out, a big number, 1 million something. Now, I'm at home because Johnny's secretary called me and said, Kreskin, watch the show tonight. Fred de Cordova wants you to watch it. Wrote down the number. Someone else called out 2 million something, what have you. On and on it went. And then he drew a line under it and he added the numbers. He said, I made a prediction before the show. I gave it to a gentleman in the audience. Would you come forward? The gentleman came with this envelope. He tore up, he says, this is the prediction, the total I predicted. He opened it up, and it was the wrong prediction. It was the wrong total. And the audience went, oh, and the guy thumped it. And Vincent Price, who was the next guest, came on, who knew this man well, and said, you know, you just laid the biggest bomb of your life. Well, it turns out that the crew found out that the man in the audience with the envelope had an adding machine on his lap. 20, 30 of the audience saw him adding as the numbers were called. Unfortunately, he added wrong. So when he cheated and he wrote on the piece of paper and put in the envelope, it was the wrong total. But that's not what upset that's not what upset Carson. What upset Carson was that this man was cheating, faking what I do, and using a stooge in the audience. And he turned to that man sometime later and said, you will never again, as long as I do this television show, perform on my show again. And the man he said that to was Orson Welles.
Ooh, I didn't see that one coming. Did you, Alex? Alex doesn't know any of this. He's a millennial. Anyway, but wow, that's
dramatic. Listen, we're gonna. Is that a dramatic? That's a dramatic story.
That is a dramatic
unknown to the John, and a true. And he revered him. but because he cheated and tried to fake what I do, he banned him for good. Listen, I hope we can. There's a spirit in broadcasting that I sometimes say on the stage, and that is that I never feel that I can say goodbye to people, but I like to think, Phil, in the spirit of broadcasting, that the way to say things is to be continued. And we're going to talk again when the book comes out.
We will, and I just want to grab one last thing before you go. Because I know that above all you are still a mentalist as well, but you seem to be much more of an entertainer, as you call yourself, which you are completely. I always have a last question for my show before I close it off. I just want to know, historically as a society, what were we and what are we today, and where is it going? Tell me that mentally, what you feel, what you think about it.
Let me tell that to you mentally or out loud?
Whatever you want, you tell me.
Well, our society is changing considerably. And what I worry about most of all, not just in the States and in England, but Australia, which I have a tremendous love affair with, and I say that unabashedly, is that we are becoming so overly communicated with. Hear me, folks. Hear me when I say this. The next time you pick up in your hand a cell phone or something, we are not listening to each other the way we once did. We're not hearing each other the way we once did. And folks, please, because our lives are changing, and psychologists, without saying this publicly, are aware about this. We're not feeling for each other as much as we once did. The next time you go out with a friend or someone you love, or someone you're having an affair with, or a student, or a member of your family, for God's sakes, put the cell phone away and really talk to someone.
100% agree. That is fantastic advice. And that was very eloquent of you. And on that note, I thank you for coming on my show. We leave it at that. Best of luck with the book. And please send my love to Rickles for me.
Oh, I will.
Okay.
And we'll talk very, very soon. That I foresee.
Perfect. I am so happy you came on. And on that note, peace out, society, and or try to be that way at least. Thank you, and have a good day. Cheers. Thank you, sir.